Assalamu alaikum. We begin with lecture 10 today. In the last lectures, I concluded a discussion on Coleridge with you, and we will begin with another romantics today, another one of the romantic poet today. Up till now, we have looked at Wordsworth's and Coleridge's work. Wordsworth and Coleridge, as I mentioned in the opening lectures, both of them belong to the Wordsworth and Coleridge, as I mentioned in the opening lectures, both of them belong to the older generation of romantic poets. They were the ones who introduced changes in poetry and who introduced a new role for poet in the domain of poetry. Now, the three younger romantic poets, out of which we are going to look at Shelley and Keats. They followed in the footsteps of these older generation poets, but nonetheless they were also they were not just different in their approaches towards nature, in their relation towards man, and in the other aspects of life. They had their differences from these poets belonging to the older generation as well as amongst them. As in fact, each of the romantic poet is distinguished by his own peculiarity, in theme, by his own peculiarity in style, and by his own peculiarity of expression. Each romantic poet has his own personality to express, and they give vent to their own feelings, but they are all marked by a sensitivity towards nature. They're all marked by the emotions and the feelings that charge their poems or their works, and in their emphasis on feelings and emotions rather than on logic and mind. And also, most specifically, they are marked by their the distinctive role that they give to the poet. The poet for the romantics is like a prophet. As we shall see, for Shelley, a poet assumes in fact the role of a prophet. And in fact, all romantics saw that a poet has an important role to play in society, in lives of individuals. So poets were important peoples, as we saw with Wordsworth. A poet is blessed with sensitivity. He's blessed with a sensitive soul. He's blessed with the power of imagination, the power of recollection, and through which he achieves a transformation, and through which he can compose great pieces of poetry. And with Coleridge we saw that a poet is blessed with what he calls the secondary imagination, which surpasses the primary imagination, and it is because of this ability to use secondary imagination that the poet can compose great pieces of imagination. And so he's a distinguished individual. So we shall see that with Shelley, the roles of poetry as well as the roles of the poet, they assume a different role, but he shares similarities with these two poets that I've just mentioned, and some of the other romantic poets in a lot of respects, as we shall see through his work, that the reason they are called romantics is because of those common features that they all share. So in today's class, we're going to look at Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and we shall analyze his first poem also, his one poem, which is the Ode to the West Wind. So let's begin with our lecture. Let's first discuss Shelley as a poet. As a poet, he's a revolutionary English poet, because he believes that through poetry, through literature, the poet can bring about revolution. The poet can bring about change in the society. He was fed up with the existing institutions in the society. He was fed up with the political, social, established norms and the political institutions of the society. He wanted them all to be demolished, and he wanted to raise new structures So in that sense, he was a revolutionary, and in that sense also, he was an optimist. He was not a pessimist. He was fed up with the present, but he saw a bright future ahead. So he is a revolutionary poet, and he's an optimistic poet, as we shall see when we analyze his poem Ode to the West Wind. So Shelley is different from the other poets. Also in his, with respect to his treatment of nature, he differs from Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth, as you saw, sees the spirit moving through nature by recognizing the presence of which man finds tranquility and peace and spiritual blessedness and harmony. And with Coleridge, you saw how he blends the supernatural with the natural world, and he talks about the effect of both the worlds on man. So he establishes a strange kind of relationship. But with Shelley, we shall see that nature is most often used as a metaphor. It's a metaphor or a vehicle for change. Nature is used to bring about change, the power of nature. Through the power of nature, in fact, Shelley wants to change society. He says, as just like nature is powerful in its act, it gives death, it brings about death, but at the same time it gives new life to plantation, vegetation, to the animal kingdom. In the same way, he says, mankind also needs revolutions. It needs rebirth of ideas. It needs rebirth of new systems. So he is a revolutionary, and he seeks nature as an help, as an aid. Nature is a metaphor for it. Nature is a metaphor for change. Nature is a vehicle for change, the means that he adopts to bring about that change. And in 1881, he and his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, they had published a pamphlet, The Necessity of Atheism. And as a result of the publication of this pamphlet, they were both expelled from the university. So he had established himself as an atheist after the publication of this journal or this pamphlet. So he, in that sense, you can say he was not a believer. He had rejected the Christian doctrines, and he opposed the dogma of a creator or a God. He was an atheist in that sense. But you shall see that in his poetry, the images are not, they are not of a secular mind alone. He does offer us some images taken from the Bible, taken from the field of religion itself. And because of these, and the pressure on him, because of his rejection, the rejection of his own society, the rejection of the religious, social, and the political order of him as an individual, as a human being, he had to struggle a lot. He was not accepted by his own people because of his ideas, and so he wanted to, and that was why he wanted to initiate social and political reforms. We mentioned earlier on that most of these romantics were affected by the French Revolution. I talked about it in the very opening lectures. The French Revolution had great impact on all romantic poets, and we saw that Wordsworth and Coleridge were affected by it. They were taken along with it for some time, but after the revolution itself collapsed and Napoleon himself established himself as an autocrat rule, and all the dreams were shattered of people who had associated change, revolution for good. They were all disappointed with it. So Wordsworth and Coleridge too pulled back, and they were disappointed with the revolution and with mankind in general, and that was why they turned inwards, they turned elsewhere. With Shelley, we shall see that he was a part of the sentiments of people in the beginning when the French Revolution was in its initial stages. So he wanted change. He was for change. He wanted the monarchy to end. He wanted the autocrat rule to end. He wanted the one-man show to end. And when the results were different, he was also disappointed, but he never left hope. He never left hope in revolutions, in change. So that is what he demands through his poetry, because he felt that in his own country, in England, too, reforms were needed, reforms at all levels, religious, social, political level, and he wanted all the existing institutions to be demolished and new institutions to be built in their place. And this is why his very first poem, by the title Queen Mab, which was printed in 1813, that also, through the poem, he also advocated the destruction of the established institutions. And because he was becoming a person not acceptable in his own country, he had to leave the country, and he finally settled down in Italy and spent most of his lifetime in Italy. And he in fact drowned in Italy also. His poems, now as a poet, we shall see that he believes that poetry should play a significant role in bringing about that reform or that change that he believes in. So in his poetry also we shall see that he has a philosophy. He has a philosophy. He has ideas for change, and he has belief in the human capacity to bring about change and progress. So in that sense, he is an optimist. And there are various themes in his poems. Some of them I will mention now, but we can discuss them in detail later on. Some of those themes are power of the natural world, and secondly, the revolt against the unjust social and the political systems, and thirdly, there is a struggle for change. It is also significant that these young romantic poets, they were also in touch with each other. They knew each other's works, they read each other's works, and they admired each other. Shelley in particular was fond of Keats. He had read Keats and he was fond of his poetry. He believed that Keats, if he had lived on, would have gone on to become a superstar, would have gone on to surpass even him in poetry. So I'll read out what he said about Keats during one of his visits to Shelley's place in Italy. Keats was paying a visit to Shelley in Italy, and he fell ill during that visit because Keats suffered from tuberculosis at that time. So while Keats was at his place, Shelley had written to his friend. He said, "I am aware indeed that I am nourishing a rival who will far surpass me, and this is an additional motive and will be an added pleasure." So you see, he's not he doesn't feel threatened by him. In fact, he feels elated. He's full of joy that Keats had to stay with him a couple of days. We shall see that when Keats later on dies in a few months' time, Shelley was really depressed. He was saddened by Keats' death, so much so that he wrote an elegy. He dedicated a poem for Keats. It's a long poem with the title Adonais. Shelley was not just a poet, he was also a critic. And as a critic, he had written an essay in defense of poetry called A Defense of Poetry. And in this essay, he defended poetry. He defended poetry as well as defined the role of the poets. Just a few extracts to give you an idea how he viewed poet and poetry. When he's describing poetry, he calls it an expression of imagination. So poetry is the use of imagination by the poet. And then when he describes poets, he calls them the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And you know, legislators are those who draw up rules, those who make up laws for us. So he says they are the actual legislators of the world, but they are not acknowledged for their work. They are unacknowledged. such is the significant role that the poets play. And as I mentioned earlier on, for him a poet is like a prophet. He's a prophet because he talks about revolution, he talks about change, he is against the existing systems, and he's looking ahead into the future, and he sees a glorious future ahead. So in that sense he defines the role of a poet as a prophet. And he also said that a poet is the author of revolutions in opinions. So he believed that through literature, especially through poetry, change in ideas, change in people's ideas can be brought about. So he is a social reformer. He's a reformer. He's a revolutionary. He wanted to reform society, but through his works, through the power of poetry, through the power of language, through the power of words, he wants to affect change, he wants to bring about change, and he wants people to change their set beliefs, to change their set ideas, and he looks ahead and sees a bright future. So that is why his poetry holds great attraction for people. He is an individual who's sparked with energy. He's an individual who's optimistic about future, who believes that change is imminent, who believes that revolutions will come about, and who believes in change for the better. We shall see that in his poem Ode to the West Wind, he's talking about a similar change, and we shall also see how hopeful he is about that change. And we shall also see how he designates the poet as with that important role of bringing about that change. Let us now begin with his poem Ode to the West Wind. He calls it Ode to the West Wind, and ode is basically a lyrical poem which is in which an object is addressed, a natural object is addressed, and normally it is written in praise of an object. So but he is here, the object is the west wind. It is important that you know the location and the setting of the poem, because he is a true romantic in the sense that he actually experiences an event and then he composes a poem based on that event. So he's not unlike Wordsworth and Coleridge in his association and in his relation with nature. So let's first see how the poem was composed. It is a lyrical poem in which the poet is talking about his feelings and emotions. So that is first thing that you need to know, that in this poem the poet gives vent to his own emotions and feelings, and he talks about how charged he is with these feelings and emotions as he witnesses an event taking place in nature, which is a storm gathering, a storm brewing up. He sees fierce winds blowing, he sees clouds gathering in the sky, he sees a whole lot of activity going on around him in nature, and he gets so impressed with the power of nature that he associates himself and his own ideas and his poem and his words with the objects of nature, and he wants that power of nature to spread his ideas. So this is what the whole poem is about. So it's basically about his own feelings. It was published in 1822. No, I'm sorry. The poem was published in 1820. It was written in the autumn of 1819 in a forest on Arno River near Florence, Italy. And as I just mentioned, it was inspired by a violent storm which was sweeping across the Atlantic Ocean and which Shelley himself had witnessed. I'm sure you're aware of the geographical location of Italy. Italy is located on the banks of Mediterranean River, and the Mediterranean Sea. Italy is on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea, in fact, which the Mediterranean Sea is a sea which divides Europe from Africa. And this is a peaceful sea, it's a peaceful region. The Mediterranean Sea is hardly ever stormy, and it is normally peaceful. But the wind and the disturbance in the oceans that Shelley here talks about are associated with the Atlantic Ocean, because it is the west wind that he's talking about. It is a wind that is coming from the west, and it is a west wind that when it blows, it brings about with it a change in season. It is the autumn season right now, when Shelley is about to compose the poem, is composing the poem. And with the coming of the west wind, west cool winds, the rains, and then the rains are brought, and these rains are accompanied with snow, and later on the winter season, which is a season of death of vegetation, death of the animal kind. So the west wind in that sense is significant, because it is associated with change, bringing change in the season. Another significant thing about the poem is that it is written in a stanza form, which is associated with Italian poets, especially with the Italian poet Dante. So we can say he's emulating it, or he's writing in that particular stanza form because he was writing in Italy. So, but he uses a stanza form which was used by Dante in his famous poem, The Divine Comedy. Now, terza rima is a stanza which consists of tercets. A tercet is a 3-line stanza. A couplet is 2-line. A tercet is 3-line. So it's a stanza of 3 lines with interlocking rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme is determined by the last word of each line, and the rhyme scheme of these stanzas which are tercets, a stanza of 3 lines each. So they have interlocking rhyme scheme. For example, the first tercet has a rhyme scheme A, B, A, and then the next stanza or the next tercet will have B taken from the first stanza and C, B, and the next then will have C, D, C. So you can see each stanza is sort of linked, it is interlocked, they are all interlinked, they are all interlocked. This is why we call it interlocking rhyme scheme. The poem that we will study, it's a short poem, but it is divided into parts. It is divided into 5 parts by Shelley, and each part consists of 4 tercets and 1 couplet. Each part consists of 4 tercets and a couplet. The theme of the first 3 parts is the power of the west wind. So first 3 parts talk about how the west wind brings about changes in nature. And in the next 2 parts, poet talks about his own feelings, he talks about his own emotions, and he talks about his own desires to use that power of nature. And he talks about change. In the last part, we also see that poet talks about the west wind and he is so inspired by west wind that he appeals to the west wind to infuse him with a new spirit, and to infuse him with the power to spread his ideas of change. So he invokes west wind because it nurtures also. It is a means to bring about life also. It's not just associated with death, but it also brings about life. It drives away, takes away, scatters the autumn leaves. It places the seeds in their seed beds under the earth, and it brings thunderstorms, it brings rains, it stirs seas and oceans, so it's life-giving also. It causes rebirth also. As it destroys, it also preserves. This is the main theme of the poem, how west wind is not just a source of destruction, but it is also a source of preservation. And how Shelley uses west wind to destroy the existing political, social structures around in the Western countries, especially in his own country, and to bring about a rebirth, to bring about a change, bring about a revolution, to bring new structures, new institutions in the place of the old ones. So this is the major theme of the poem, of this poem. So since it is divided into parts, we will also study the different parts separately with emphasis, and then later on we are going to connect all the parts. So the first part with which we begin today shows the action of the west wind on earth. I just described to you that when the wind comes from the Atlantic Ocean from the west, it's not passive. It is like a storm, and it is fast and it is furious, and it changes, brings about changes in all spheres. It brings about changes on land, on the earth, and on the ocean, on the waters, and also in the sky. Stirs up clouds. So the action is on in different spheres of the natural world, and Shelley also discusses them separately. So in the first part he only looks at the action of the west wind on land, on the earth. So let's see how he talks about or describes the action of the west wind on the earth. So let's begin with the poem. He says, "O wild west wind, O wild west wind." There's an alliteration also, whir, whir, whir. "O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven, like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing." Shelley uses a lot of poetic devices in his poem. We shall see that he uses different similes, different metaphors in all parts of the poem. In fact, the west wind itself is a metaphor, like I explained in the beginning. It is a metaphor for change. This is a metaphor. The west wind is also personified. It is personified as a spirit. So the west wind is some kind of a spirit in nature with a lot of power, with a lot of energy, with a lot of force to bring about change in nature. So it's a spirit, it's personified as a spirit, as a breathing spirit, and it is also, in the same way, we can say it is a metaphor for change, because he uses it, compares west wind with his ideas of change. So it is a metaphor in that sense, but as we shall see, it will assume different roles as the poem develops. So he says, "O wild west wind, O wild west wind." He addresses a west wind as wild. He calls it wild, and he's addressing it. He's talking to the west wind. He's not talking to us. He's not talking to you. He's not talking to me. He's talking to the west wind. Remember that Shelley is sitting in the forest by the river Arno, and he sees the weather changing. He sees the storm coming. He sees the movement of the clouds in the sky. He notices the force of the wind as it blows leaves around, and it bends trees, and how it moves waters. So he is witnessing all that. So he describes the force of that wind. He calls it wild. Now wild is a word that we associate with something that is uncontrollable. Uncontrollable. something that cannot be contained, something that cannot be disciplined. So he says, "O wild west wind, O west wind, you cannot be controlled. You cannot be disciplined. You cannot be changed. You cannot be molded. You are wild. So you have extreme power also. Thou breath of autumn's being." And then he says, "You are the breath of autumn." So it is, autumn here is personified. Autumn is written with capital A, so autumn is given the human-like qualities. Autumn is, the season autumn is personified. He says autumn is personified as a human being. Autumn is personified maybe as a spirit, maybe as an angel, but as a breathing human being, as a breathing spirit. He says, "You are the breath of autumn." So autumn takes, when it takes breath, it breathes the air out. So he calls the west wind the breath of autumn, which brings about this change. "Thou, from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven, like ghosts." So the leaves, the dead leaves, which are made to scatter under the force of the west wind. And you know that in the autumn season, the winds, the leaves on the trees become dry, shriveled, crumpled. They change in color from green to different shades, and they are almost dead. So, and they're easily shed. They're easily shed from the trees. So this is why he's talking about these leaves being scattered all over the place, all around him, as the west wind blows. But he compares these dead leaves to ghosts. So this is a simile that he uses here. He says that these dead leaves are like ghosts, and they are like ghosts which are running from a magician or an enchanter. So the magician or an enchanter, he is trying to call these ghosts to him, but the ghosts are running away from him, just like because of the coming of the west wind, the leaves are scattering and running in all directions. So the comparison that he makes is of the leaves with the ghosts. Then he further describes the leaves to you. He says, "Yellow and black and pale and hectic red." And these are the colors of autumn: yellow, black, pale, and hectic red. So bright red. So and these colors are also not the colors of happiness or colors of life. Yellow is the color of sickness, disease. Black in the same way is not a color we associate with life. Pale, he says, they are pale and they are hectic red. Again, something, it's not like green or it's not like blue. So these are the colors of autumn, and these are the colors of these leaves. He says, pestilence-stricken multitudes. So he further describes these leaves to you. He says, they are pestilence-stricken. Pestilence-stricken means they are diseased. Pestilence is a disease. So they appear, with their appearance, they look as if they are diseased. They are sick. And multitudes, they are in large number. Naturally, he was in a forest. Shelley, when he was writing, he was in a forest. There were trees all around him. All the trees, if they were shedding their leaves, so these the leaves that he must be witnessing must be in large number. So he calls them pestilence-stricken multitudes. So they're half dead. They're dead leaves, and they're dead leaves. That is why they look as if they are pestilence-stricken. They're not beautiful to look at. And then he says, "O thou." Now he introduces another simile, a next simile. He says, "O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds." Now another simile is introduced. He says, "O thou," he's still talking to the west wind. He says, "O you," thou means you, "O you, the west wind, what do? You chariotist, you are a charioteer." A charioteer is the driver of a carriage, the carriage that is driven by horses, which we used to have in the old times in place of cars. Now we have automobiles and cars and trucks and whatnot. But in those times they used to have carriages, open carriages also, and closed carriages for women when they could sit inside, or open carriages like we have nowadays in the villages, the carts, which are driven sometimes by horses, sometimes by other animals. So he says, you are the charioteer, you are the driver of the chariot, of the carriage. And what are you driving? What are you carrying? He says, you're carrying the winged seeds. Okay, you are the charioteer. So upon the waves of the west wind, the seeds are carried. The seeds are carried, and the seeds are carried where? He says, they are carried to the dark wintry bed. To the dark wintry bed. The dark wintry bed gives us the impression of the graves, which he's going to compare it to later on. Because he says, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave. So the winged seeds are further then compared to the corpses, dead bodies lying in the grave. So he says that you are carrying them, you're carrying these winged seeds, which are like the corpses, which are like the dead bodies, and you're carrying, as if you are carrying these dead bodies, you want to take them to their graves, you want to bury them in their graves, you want to give them proper burial. So he says, in a similar way, the west wind, just like a charioteer carries in his carriage the dead bodies and takes them to their graves, O you, the west wind, you carry seeds upon your waves, you carry these seeds to their graves, which are the wintry bed. They are cold, and there they lie low, and they lie until a specific time when they can come out again, and they can bloom and blossom into plants. So this is the simile that he gives you, and the image that he creates for you. Until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth. And he says, these seeds, O west wind, the seeds that you carry and take to their wintry beds, they will lie until when? Until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth. And these seeds will lie in their earth, in their grave, until, he says, your sister, and the sister is there's a wind, spring wind. So the sister of this autumn wind, or the west wind, is the spring wind. He says, these seeds will remain in their beds until the spring wind blows. And he uses the color blue, azure. Azure is the blue color of the sky. He says, which is also the color of life. So he says, when your sister, the spring wind, which is a symbol of life, when it blows, these seeds will come out. They will come out of the dreaming earth. So he wants to give us the impression that in the season of winter, the earth, although looks dead, because all vegetation is dead, but he says it is not a complete kind of a death. The earth is apparently dead, but it is dreaming. It is dreaming of the good times ahead. It is dreaming of change. It is dreaming of the spring season, of the beauties of the spring season. So the earth is dreaming. The earth is dreaming of life, of regeneration, of rebirth. And clarion is a trumpet. So when the spring wind blows, or it blows a trumpet, it blows its sound for change, the dreaming earth will wake up. Okay? The dreaming earth will wake up and fill, he says, with living hues and odors plain and hill. And fill the whole all place. I will look at the words in brackets later on. Let's first connect and get the idea. He says that the dreaming earth will fill with living hues and odors plain and hill. So when the spring wind comes, it is going to let the dreaming earth come out of its dream and its dreaming, and bring about a change in nature. And this change will be that it will offer living hues, living colors, colors of life. There will be colors of life, there will be signs of life, there will be the birth of life. And he says there will be not just the colors for the eyes to see, but he talks about the odors. He talks about the smell. He says there will be pleasant smell all around also. And this whole change which will be brought about with the coming of the spring wind, he compares it to the driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air. So he says the sweet buds here in fact are compared to the flocks of sheep which are grazing in the fields. So it's the sweet buds, the budding flowers, the flowers that come out of those seeds which the west wind had sown under the earth, and which lay under the earth while the earth dreamt of the spring season. And with the coming of the spring wind, all these seeds, they give out life, and plants and flowers and sweet buds, they blossom. And he says they blossom and they spread their colors and they spread their smell in the air everywhere. Like you see, there is flock everywhere on the hills, scattered around the hill. They are the buds are compared to the flocks because they are everywhere. Wild spirit, which art moving everywhere, again by the close of this part, he emphasizes the wild aspect of the west wind. And then he also talks about the spirit part of the west wind. He calls it a spirit which is wild, which has gone wild, which is uncontrollable, which are moving everywhere, you see. So they're both compatible. Wild, which is moving everywhere, which is not under anyone's control. It has its own power. But then he calls it a destroyer and preserver, and through these two words he sums up the theme of this stanza. In fact, the theme of the whole poem also. But he closes this part with the idea of the west wind as a destroyer as well as a preserver. So it destroys. It destroys nature. It it makes trees shed their leaves. It scatters trees, the dead, pestilence-stricken trees, leaves of the trees in all directions. But in the process, it also scatters seeds. It takes seeds to their beds. So in that sense, it is also a preserver. It preserves life, because later on, with the coming of the spring season, this life which was preserved, it blooms again. So it is a cyclical motion, and nature is cyclical. It does have a cyclical death and then birth. So there is death and then there is regeneration, or then there is rebirth with the change in seasons. And this is the pattern of nature. This is a pattern in nature. And this is what Shelley wants also to become part of the human life. He says, when something has become deceased, like those pestilence-stricken leaves, when institutions, when individuals, they become deceased, they become like dead leaves, they must be discarded, they must be thrown away, they must be destroyed, they must be brought to an end. So they're destroyed. So just like the west wind destroys the pestilence-stricken dead leaves and takes them away, in the same way, he says, the poet's role is to bring about change in the society, just like the west wind. He should act like the spring wind, and he should cause, he should help in the process of regeneration. He should help in the process of rebirth, and he should help bring about change in the society. We now look at part 2, and in part 2 Shelley is going to talk about the action in the sky. In part 1 he spoke about the action of the west wind on earth, and now he looks towards the sky and he sees movement in the sky. He sees a great deal going on in the sky. He sees the clouds moving around, and he can feel the power of the west wind even in the skies. And now he wants to utilize that power of the west wind also. So let's see how he does it. Thou. Again he begins with thou. So he's speaking to the west wind. He's addressing the west wind. He says, thou on whose stream, amid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are shed. So in this part he begins with comparing the west wind to its action on the clouds in the sky. In the first part he talked about the leaves and the seeds. Now he talks about, here he talks about clouds. First he talks about clouds, how west wind drives away the clouds, just like it drove away the leaves in the previous stanza. So it's not just the earth which is filled with activity, it's also the sky. There is activity in all parts of nature. So he calls the sky, for the sky he used the description steep. Steep skies, commotion. Commotion refers to movement, disturbance. So he says there is in the steep skies, in the sky ahead, there is also commotion, movement, disturbance. What kind of disturbance? He says there are loose clouds. There are clouds scattered all around the sky. There are clouds scattered in all places of the sky. And he compares these clouds to the leaves. So he connects the two parts thematically also. He says these clouds are scattered about in the sky like the leaves scattered on the earth. Shook from the tangled boughs of heaven and ocean, angels of rain and lightning. He's still talking of the clouds, but now he says that these clouds, because he is comparing them to the leaves. The clouds are being compared to the leaves which were scattered on the earth, because leaves are shed from the branches of the trees. So Shelley still hangs on to that same imagery. So he says, as just like on the earth, the dead leaves are shed from the branches of the trees, these clouds which are scattered around in the sky, they are also shed, they are also shaken from the tangled boughs. Boughs are the branches, the tangled branches or boughs of heaven and the ocean. Heaven and ocean. So again he's connecting the earth with the sky. He's talking about ocean because clouds are formed with the help of ocean. It's the moisture taken from ocean which helps forming clouds, and they are also part of the heavens. So he says clouds are actually the branches of clouds are shaken They're thrown, they're scattered like leaves all over the sky from the branches of heaven and the earth. So clouds are like leaves which are shed, which are shaken from branches of heaven and the ocean. Angels of rain and lightning, and then he further calls them, angels. They are angels of rain and lightning because they bring about rain. So they have clouds are personified here. They cause lightning and they cause rain. They are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce monad. Now Shelley, like Coleridge, we see likes to use some of the mythical references. So he talks about one of the Greek savage women here. But he is still talking about clouds. He's describing how the clouds are scattered, spread in the sky. He says these clouds are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge. Of thine airy surge. He's talking about the west wind, but he says that these clouds, they are carried over on your waves, on your surge, on the airy surge, on thine airy surge. So these clouds are shifting in the sky. They're moving in the sky. They're scattering in the sky. They're changing places in the sky, carried on your waves, on your surge. So the west wind is moving like a wave, which is dislocating clouds. So just like it distributes, scatters leaves on the earth, in the same way the west wind is causing clouds to shift in the sky. They're changing position. So there is commotion, movement in the sky. And this is, I'm sure you know, this is what happens when there is a storm, when there is fierce winds. The clouds just don't stay in the sky. They're not fixed to their places. They're shifting. When there's wind, they're shifting a lot. So he says, carried over on your surge, carried over on your waves, they are shifting places. Like, now there's a simile. He says, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce monarch. And how are these clouds shifting places? He says, they look like the bright hair which are uplifted from the head of some fierce monad. This monad or monad, it is one of the wild savage women with god Dionysus, who in Greek mythology is a god of wine and revelry. So she accompanies this woman. She accompanies this god, but she's got hair which are electrified, and they are straight. They stand above her head. They stand straight, vertically above her head. That is why he says bright hair uplifted from the head. So they are vertical. The hair are vertical upon her head. So in the same way he says, just like her hair are standing vertically on her head, in the same way these clouds are scattered vertically across the sky. Even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height. And how are they arranged? He says, from the zenith, from the horizon to the zenith, to the height of the sky. So the sky, the clouds cover all the space that is between the earth and the sky's zenith, the sky's topmost place. There are clouds everywhere, from the horizon straight up to the zenith's height. So like the bright hair of some fierce monad, he says. The locks of the approaching storm. So here also he uses the word locks. Now he's calling the clouds as locks. He's describing, he first described the clouds as leaves to you. Now he describes the clouds as locks, as hair. Locks are the hair So he describes the clouds as a hair of the approaching storm. So storm is personified. The storm is personified as a spirit which has got electrified hair, or maybe you can say the storm is compared to the fierce monad. So, and this storm is like this woman who's got electrified hair with this, and the hair are going in all direction vertically, and such is this storm, that the clouds are going vertically in all direction. They're arranged in the sky. They fill up the sky. So after describing this commotion, this activity, or this shifting of clouds in the sky, he now introduces another theme. He says, "Thou dirge, you are the dirge." The dirge is the funeral song. The funeral song. He says, "Thou dirge, O west wind, you are the funeral song. You're like the funeral song. You're the last song of the dying year." Now you know that winter season comes at the end of the year. So he says, this is what he's referring to, that this year is about to pass, so this year is dying, and new year will come. So you are the last song. You are the funeral song of this year. You are the funeral song of this year, because after this year will be dead, and it will no longer be able to hear any song. So you are the last song. You are the last funeral song of this year which is dying, to which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre. And he says that you are this night, he says, and this night is also the last night. This closing night is the dome of the vast sepulchre. So he says, and you will sing this sound, they will sing this song, this funeral song, in this last night, in this closing night. So this night then is compared to a dome, and he says the night is like a dome because the night is spread like a dome. When the night comes, it is as if it has blocked the sun's light. So we are now under some kind of a cover. So the night spreads is compared to a dome. A dome is a round ceiling which we see on top of mosques and some other buildings, sometimes mostly holy. So he says a sepulchre is also a tomb. It's a vast tomb. So this song, he says, it will be heard, it will be played, the west wind with its roaring noise, with its roaring sound. So now he's talking about the sound that the west wind is creating. It's not just the effect on leaves and clouds anymore, but he's talking about its own sound, which he says is like a song, and which is the last song, because this year will be dead after this, and this night will bring about the death of this year. So this night is like a holy place, is like a holy dome, is a holy tomb in which this year will be embedded. So it will become its grave. This night will become the grave of this dying year. Vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. Oh, hear. And he says this night, this tomb, how is it stretched? How is it kept? It is this night, this tomb is stretched, it is surrounded, it is supported, it is upheld, whatever you can say it is. This great tomb, this arch, the arches are supported, he says, by vapors, by the congregated might of vapors. Because he now feels that the clouds have maybe come so low that they are ready to burst out into rain. So maybe it brings to your mind the image of soldiers which are ready to attack. So he says, so they are, but he's talking about the coming of the rain and the closing of this night. And so the night is the tomb, is the grave of the dying year, and the wind is playing the last song for the dying year. And this night is supported by vapors. He says strong vapors, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. And he says soon. Now such an atmosphere is created that he says that I can feel that soon there's going to be rain and fire and hail. Now rain, but he calls it black rain. You must remember that naturally it's also the night time, but maybe he's also, because he's talking about the dying here, maybe we can say he says black rain because he's talking about death here. But rain will burst. He says soon these clouds are going to burst into rain, and fire. By fire he means the lightning in the clouds. So he's saying soon there will be more lightning in the clouds, and hail will burst. And you know what is hail? The solid mass of ice. So soon there will be hail, fire and rain. And oh, hear. So he says, oh, hear, can you hear the sound of the west wind? With this, we come to the end of part 2. And you see how powerful both the parts were. They were powerful because of the language, because of the imagery that he creates, because of the poetic devices that he uses, and also because of the message that he is trying to convey. Each part conveys a message to you, the same message, a similar message, but he does it by using different similes, and he does it by using different metaphors for you. In the first part, he talked about the power of the west wind on the earth, how with its power it scatters leaves and it takes seeds to their beds, where they lie in cold and in darkness until the spring wind brings about regeneration and rebirth. So he talks about the west wind there as a destroyer, but also a preserver, because it destroys what was dying, but preserves what is yet to come. So Shelley's message is the same here, that of a revolutionary. He also wants change in his society. So in the second part, you saw that he speaks about the power of the wind in the sky, and with its power, the impact that it has on the clouds, how the clouds are shifted in the sky, and how they're compared to the fierce woman, and how they're compared to that fierce spirit, Manad, her hair. And first they're compared to leaves, and they're compared to hair, and then he talks about how this year, this night, is the last year, and the night is a tomb of this last year, and the wind, with the sound of the wind, is like the last song of the year. So he's with these connecting images, he gives you the similar powerful message, and the message is that change is imminent, change will come about. This year death has to come to this year. This society is dying, and it will die soon, and there will be, after its death, there will be a new one and a better one. So through each image, he conveys to you his message forcefully, and the message is that of a reformer, and the message is that of a revolutionary. In the next lecture, we will analyze the rest of the parts, and we will also discuss the themes that emerge from this poem. So I will take leave from you here, and we will meet again in the next lecture.